October 24, 1944, Sibuyan Sea. The sky is painted in fury. American dive bombers screaming through clouds. The ocean churning black with oil and steel fragments. And in the center of it all, cutting through the chaos like a god refusing to die, floats the pride of Imperial Japan, Musashi. 72,000 tons of iron confidence. The largest battleship ever to taste salt water. Her engines roar beneath the deck. The hull trembles. 9 18-inch guns point skyward, barrels thick as train tunnels. Crew members rush between stations, faces streaked with sweat and smoke. They believe in this ship. They believe in the armor, 16 inches of hardened steel wrapped around vital spaces. Armor, they were told, that nothing in the world could break. But here's what they don't know yet, what nobody knows, what won't become clear until decades later, when divers find her shattered remains scattered across the seafloor 900 meters below. The thing that would kill Musashi wasn't just American firepower. It was something far more intimate, a flaw hidden deep in her bones, a design choice made years ago in secret shipyards, a compromise between ambition and physics that Japanese engineers never fully solved. Sometimes the deadliest enemy isn't the one firing at you, it's the one built into your own foundation. If you love untold stories of engineering and warfare, hit subscribe, because what happens next rewrites everything. To understand how Musashi died, you have to go back to 1934, Tokyo. The Imperial Japanese Navy had just withdrawn from the Washington Naval Treaty, those international agreements that tried to prevent another arms race after World War I. Japan's admirals knew the math. America's industrial capacity was 10 times larger. In any drowned-out war, the United States could simply outbuild them. So the IJN made a different bet. We can't build more ships, but we can build better ones. The plan was audacious. Design a battleship so powerful, so heavily armored, so overwhelming in firepower, that it could defeat 2 or 3 American battleships at once. A ship that would tip the scales through sheer individual superiority. They called it the Yamato class. 2 would be built, Yamato and Musashi. The specifications were staggering. 18.1-inch main guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Shells weighing nearly 1.5 tons each. Armor plates up to 26 inches thick in places. The design aimed to create an immunity zone where the ship could devastate enemies from ranges where they couldn't hurt her. Everything about these ships was built in secrecy. Workers signed oaths. Aerial photography over the shipyards was forbidden. Even the ship's blueprints would be destroyed before war's end. But secrets have a cost. Musashi was laid down in March 1938 at Mitsubishi's Nagasaki shipyard. The construction alone was a feat of industrial might. Over 3 years of round-the-clock work. Thousands of workers who didn't fully understand what they were building. The ship that emerged in August 1942 was breathtaking. 863 feet long, beams so wide she couldn't fit through the Panama Canal, by design. This meant American battleships would be constrained by canal dimensions. Musashi wouldn't be. Her armor scheme followed the all-or-nothing principle. Vital areas were wrapped in unprecedented protection. Magazine spaces, engine rooms, command centers, all enclosed in a heavily armored citadel that ran roughly half the ship's length. But here's where the engineering decisions got complicated. The designers wanted maximum underwater protection. They created a torpedo defense system 17 feet deep. Layers of compartments, void spaces, and bulkheads designed to absorb the energy of underwater explosions. They even included a thick lower belt armor that extended below the waterline. This lower belt was supposed to protect against an unusual threat, Shells that struck the hull underwater after hitting the water at shallow angles. It was brilliant defensive thinking against surface combat. But that same rigid, heavy lower belt would become a structural liability when facing a different threat entirely, one the designers hadn't fully accounted for. The problem lived in a joint, a seam, the place where the main armor belt connected to the lower belt and torpedo bulkheads. When you're building a warship with armor this thick, 16 inches in places, joining different sections becomes an engineering nightmare. You need welds, rivets, and supporting structures that can hold thousands of tons of steel plate in alignment while the ship flexes and moves through heavy seas. Japanese engineers designed this joint to handle the stress of normal operation, even enemy shell fire. But underwater explosions from torpedoes behave differently than shells. When a torpedo detonates against a ship's hull, it creates a pressure wave that moves through water faster than sound. This shock wave hits the steel plates with tremendous force. Ideally, thinner, more elastic armor would flex and deform, absorbing the energy. But the Yamato class had that thick, rigid lower belt. When torpedoes struck, the belt was too stiff to bend properly. Instead of absorbing the blast, it transmitted the force to its weakest point, the joints where it connected to other structures. The welds and supporting brackets weren't designed for that kind of stress. They would fail. When they did, the entire seam could rupture, letting seawater pour into spaces that were supposed to remain watertight. Nobody realized this until it was too late. For her first 2 years, Musashi barely fought. She moved between anchorages, Truk, Kure, Palau, a floating fortress looking for a battle that never came. In March 1944, she got a warning shot. The American submarine USS Tunney caught Musashi near Palau and fired 6 torpedoes. One struck near the bow. Flooding began immediately. Musashi survived, limped back to Kure for repairs. The damage was concerning. For such a heavily armored ship, she'd been badly hurt by just 1 torpedo hit. But the real significance went unnoticed. During repairs, crews noticed water had spread farther than the torpedo defense system should have allowed. Something about how the compartments flooded wasn't matching the design specifications. But war doesn't pause for analysis. Musashi was patched up, her anti-aircraft guns upgraded, and sent back to the fleet. By October 1944, the Philippines were America's next target. Japan launched Shogo, Operation Victory, a desperate plan to defeat the American invasion. Nearly everything left of the Imperial Navy would be committed. Musashi and her sister Yamato formed the core of Admiral Kurita's first striking force. The plan? Punch through American defenses, reach Leyte Gulf, and destroy the invasion fleet. On October 22nd, Kurita's force departed Brunei. Destination, the Philippines. What waited for them was a killing field. October 24th, early morning. Kurita's fleet enters the Sibuyan Sea, a body of water trapped between Philippine islands. It's a natural choke point. Naval tacticians call it a fatal funnel. At 8 a.m., an American reconnaissance plane spots them. Radio crackles, coordinates transmitted. Within an hour, Admiral Halsey orders 3 carrier task groups to attack. Over 200 aircraft begin launching from carrier decks. On Musashi's bridge, Rear Admiral Inoguchi receives the reports. He requests air cover from Japanese forces in the Philippines. The reply is devastating. Most Japanese aircraft are already engaged elsewhere. Air defense would have to come from the fleet's own guns. The first wave arrives mid-morning. Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers. They circle high, identifying targets. Then they dive. Musashi becomes the primary focus. She's the largest, most symbolically important target. If American pilots can sink her, it would be a propaganda victory as much as a tactical one. Anti-aircraft fire fills the sky. 25mm guns chatter. Heavier batteries fire special anti-aircraft shells that explode into shrapnel clouds. The air itself seems solid with metal. But there are too many attackers. First wave, 1 bomb hit, 1 torpedo hit. Musashi shudders. Damage control teams rush to the impacted areas. Water begins entering through the torpedo hit. But the ship maintains course, maintains speed. It's just the beginning. Noon, second wave. 3 more torpedoes slam into Musashi's port side. The ship's massive hull rings like a struck bell. Below decks, compartments flood. Pumps engage. Counterflooding begins on the starboard side to correct the list. 1:30 p.m., third wave. 4 bombs, another torpedo. The attacks are systematic now. Pilots are learning which areas to target. They're going for the relatively unarmored bow sections, the areas forward of the armored citadel. What the attackers don't fully understand is that they're not just punching holes. Each explosion sends shockwaves through the hull structure. Each impact creates stress that accumulates. And those joints, those welded seams between the main belt and lower belt, they're taking punishment they weren't designed to absorb. Between 3 and 3:30 p.m., Enterprise and Franklin launch 69 aircraft. They find Musashi already wounded, smoke pouring from multiple fires, bow noticeably down, but still moving, still fighting. 3 bombs hit the bow area, 3 more torpedoes. With each hit, the structural joints stress further. Welds that were supposed to be temporary load bearers under normal operation now carry the weight of accumulated battle damage. Inside the torpedo defense spaces, water finds paths it shouldn't. Seams that should remain sealed begin weeping, then cracking. Metal designed to protect becomes a weakness. The ship begins its slow death spiral. Here's what's happening inside Musashi that nobody on board fully understands. Each torpedo creates a massive underwater explosion. The blast generates a pressure wave that travels through the water and hits the hull. The outer skin deforms, exactly as designed. Outer compartments of the torpedo defense system flood, also as designed. But then the shock wave hits that rigid lower armor belt. Instead of flexing and absorbing energy, the thick plates try to move as a single rigid unit. The force travels to the joints where this belt connects to other structures. These connections, welds, brackets, rivets, start failing. Not catastrophically at first, just small separations, hairline cracks. But each subsequent hit makes it worse. Water begins entering spaces that were supposed to stay dry. The ship has over 1,000 watertight compartments, but compartments are only watertight if their seals and joints hold. Progressive flooding begins. Water finds a breach in one compartment, rises, finds another weak seam, flows into an adjacent space. The flooding spreads not through obvious holes, but through structural joints failing under repeated shock. Damage control teams work frantically. Pumps run at full capacity. Counterflooding attempts to balance the ship, but they're fighting an invisible enemy, a design flaw that turns the ship's own armor into a structural vulnerability. 4 p.m., the final attack wave approaches. The 6th wave comes from 3 carriers, Intrepid, Franklin, and Cabot. 75 aircraft total, 37 focus on Musashi. The ship is already listing heavily to port, despite counterflooding efforts. Her bow sits noticeably lower. Speed has dropped to just 13 knots, but her guns still fire. More torpedoes, more bombs. The American pilots report the ship is dead in the water, heavily down by the bow, smoking from multiple fires. They're wrong about dead in the water. Musashi's crew gets her moving again through sheer will and engineering skill. But the structural damage is irreversible. Below decks, the flooding has reached critical areas. The joint failures have created paths for water to flow past supposed watertight barriers. Entire sections of the ship are compromised. Admiral Inoguchi makes a desperate decision: beach the ship on a nearby island. If Musashi can't fight, at least her guns could serve as coastal artillery. It's a last chance at dignity. The crew tries, the engines strain, but around 5:30 p.m. the engines stop. Too much flooding, too much damage to the engineering spaces. Inoguchi retires to his cabin. He's the captain. His place is with his ship. By 7 p.m., Musashi's list reaches critical angle. The physics become inevitable. Water pours through every failed joint, every ruptured seam. 7:36. She capsizes. When Musashi rolls over, she doesn't go quietly. As the ship inverts, trapped air in various compartments suddenly finds no way out. The pressure builds. Several spaces implode violently. The explosions can be heard underwater, deep, resonant booms. The bow section breaks away. The stern, already structurally weakened by flooding and joint failures, separates. The massive ship that was supposed to be unsinkable fragments into major pieces as she descends. Destroyers Kiyoshimo, Isokaze, and Hamakaze rescue 1,376 survivors from the water, but 1,023 men go down with the ship. More than 40% of her crew gone. Among them, Admiral Inoguchi. His body was never recovered. The rest of Kurita's force continues toward Leyte Gulf. They've lost their most powerful battleship, but the operation continues. The mission hasn't changed. What nobody discusses, what nobody has time to analyze, is why Musashi absorbed so much damage in some areas, but failed so comprehensively in others. Why the armor that was supposed to make her invincible became, in some ways, a structural liability. Those questions wouldn't be answered for decades, not until researchers could examine the actual wreck, not until naval architects could study what really happened to the joints and seams that failed. The truth was buried with the ship. March 2015, 70 years after the war ended. Paul Allen, Microsoft co-founder, billionaire, history enthusiast, announces his research team has found something. Deep in the Sibuyan Sea, 900 meters down. A debris field that matches Musashi's last known position. The team had spent 8 years searching. They'd studied historical records from 4 countries, analyzed ocean floor topography, deployed cutting-edge underwater drones, and finally, they'd found her. But what they found wasn't what anyone expected. The conventional wisdom was that Musashi sank intact, that somewhere at the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea, the world's largest battleship lay in one piece, a monument to naval engineering. Instead, the submersibles revealed a scattered debris field, pieces spread across a wide area, the bow section upright, the stern inverted, gun turrets blown clear of their mounts, structural sections that showed signs of explosive failure. The ship hadn't just sunk, she'd come apart. Experts studying the underwater footage began noticing something. The way certain hull sections had failed, the patterns of separation. It wasn't just battle damage. Something about the ship's internal structure had given way catastrophically. Shigeru Nakajima watched the live stream from his home in Japan. He was 94 years old. He jumped from Musashi's deck in 1944, survived. Now he was seeing his ship again. "I am certain this is Musashi," he said quietly. Post-war analysis, particularly studies conducted after Musashi's discovery, revealed what Japanese engineers couldn't fully assess during the war. The Yamato class had a fundamental design flaw. The joint between the main armor belt and the lower belt created what naval architects call a rupture-prone seam. This wasn't theoretical. This was verified through examination of Yamato's damage reports and Musashi's wreck. When torpedoes exploded against the hull, the rigid lower armor belt, designed to protect against underwater shell hits, proved too inflexible against the pressure waves from torpedo explosions. Instead of absorbing the shock, the force transmitted to the joints and supporting structures. These joints weren't adequately reinforced for that type of stress. Under repeated torpedo impacts, they failed. Welds cracked, brackets deformed, the seams opened. This allowed flooding to spread past the torpedo defense system much faster than designed. The thick armor that was supposed to be strength became a conduit for structural failure. American post-war analysts noted that the relatively shallow depth of the torpedo defense system, combined with the lack of liquid loading in defensive compartments, created additional vulnerabilities. But the joint failure was the critical issue. One U.S. naval report concluded, joint failures attributed to considerable damage from single torpedo impacts. The same joints that failed on Yamato in 1943 failed catastrophically on Musashi in 1944, and would fail again on Yamato in 1945. The irony was brutal. The rest of the Battle of Leyte Gulf played out over the next 2 days. Kurita's force, even without Musashi, penetrated to the edge of Leyte Gulf. They faced American escort carriers and destroyers in what would be called the Battle off Samar. American ships fought with desperate courage. Destroyers charged battleships. Escort carriers launched every plane they had. And Kurita, perhaps spooked by the ferocity of resistance, perhaps confused about what he was facing, withdrew. The Japanese plan failed. Shogo ended in comprehensive defeat. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships including Musashi, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The Imperial Navy would never again operate as an effective fighting force. Some historians argue that Musashi's loss wasn't tactically decisive. The battle would have been lost anyway due to overwhelming American air superiority and the success of the decoy plan against Admiral Halsey. But symbolically, strategically, psychologically, the sinking of the unsinkable battleship shattered something. If Musashi could be sunk, nothing was safe. The invincibility that Japan's super battleships were supposed to project evaporated in the Sibuyan Sea. And the Americans had only lost 18 aircraft in exchange for history's greatest battleship. The engineering failure that enabled that loss would remain hidden for 70 years. The lesson of Musashi isn't just about naval warfare. It's about the danger of designing for the last war instead of the next one. Japanese engineers created armor to withstand surface combat, shells fired from enemy battleships. They succeeded brilliantly at that. The armor scheme could theoretically resist hits from the ship's own 18-inch guns at battle ranges. But World War II became an air war. Carriers proved more valuable than battleships. And torpedoes dropped from aircraft behaved differently than shells fired from guns. The structural loads were different. The failure modes were different. The joints that worked adequately under normal conditions and even shell fire became catastrophic weak points under repeated aerial torpedo attack. This wasn't incompetence, it was designing for the wrong threat. Modern engineering has a term for this: fighting the last war, making decisions based on previous experience that may no longer apply. Musashi and Yamato were products of brilliant engineering applied to an obsolete strategic concept. They were answers to a question the war was no longer asking. The ship's records were deliberately destroyed by Japan before surrender. For decades, Western analysts could only guess at specifications and design features. The secrecy that protected them during construction became a shroud of mystery after their loss. But the wreck tells the story the blueprints can't. Every failed joint, every ruptured seam, every piece of that scattered debris field. Truth doesn't stay buried forever. Today, Musashi rests in pieces across the Sibuyan seafloor, a war grave for over 1,000 sailors. a monument to ambition and engineering that pushed boundaries but couldn't escape physics. The Philippines government has designated the site as protected waters. Divers cannot take artifacts. The ship belongs to history now. But her story resonates because it's fundamentally human. The desire to build something invincible. The belief that enough armor, enough firepower, enough engineering genius can overcome any threat. And the humbling reality that every design has limits. Every system has failure points. The joint that failed wasn't a mistake by incompetent designers. It was a compromise made by brilliant engineers working within constraints they couldn't fully predict. They protected against one threat and unknowingly created vulnerability to another. War is decided by those who understand not just how to build strength, but where strength becomes weakness. By those who see not just the armor, but the seams between the plates, the joints under stress, the welds that fail when the pressure exceeds design limits. Sometimes defeat doesn't come from the enemy's strength. It comes from not understanding your own weaknesses until the moment they destroy you. In the silence that followed her sinking, history took a deep breath and changed forever. If this untold story moved you, share it so more people discover the truths that time almost erased. Hit subscribe for more hidden chapters from history's darkest hours.